The rise of the terrorist network in Afghanistan following the U.S. withdrawal has sparked new fears about its ability to carry out attacks against American interests there and elsewhere. President Joe Biden did not feel the need to mention the Islamic State group's Afghanistan branch, known as ISIS-K, when he announced in April the U.S. plans to withdraw from its longest war and what it would mean for American interests in the region. That changed sharply just a few months later following the lightning advance of the Taliban across the country, the shocking collapse of the U.S.-backed government hours after the insurgent network arrived in Kabul, and the complete implosion of the supposed 300,000-strong Afghan military that Western countries spent 20 years trying to stand up. In announcing the end to the 20-year war in Afghanistan, Biden referenced ISIS-K almost immediately, describing the devastating bomb attack it orchestrated at the Kabul airport, killing 11 Marines, a soldier, and a Navy corpsman, the last combat casualties of the war. U.S. drones carried out a strike days later targeting what American officials said were ISIS-K planners, though an apparent secondary explosion also killed civilians. To ISIS-K, Biden added in his remarks from the White House's State Dining Room, offering a somber tone, "We are not done with you yet." This is 77 News Stations. J.Emma Clarke. Product by 77 News. Gmail 77newsandworld@gmail.com. What is ISIS-K? The Afghanistan branch of the Islamic State group takes its name from Khorasan Province, the historic name for the region encompassing parts of Central Asia, including modern-day Afghanistan and Iran. Known also as ISIS-KP, ISKP, or ISK, it began operating in Afghanistan as far back as November 2014, though at that time was limited to indigenous fighters likely disenchanted with al-Qaeda or the Taliban, who became inspired by the violent rise of the Islamic State group at that time in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. military first publicly acknowledged its existence the following year. Army General John Campbell, at the time the top U.S. military officer for operations in Afghanistan, made a passing reference to the operationally emergent group, bolstered by some foreign fighters, during congressional testimony as a part of his argument for why the U.S. should send more troops to Afghanistan. This came despite objections from Barack Obama, who won the presidency on a platform of bringing Americans home from war and planned to do so in Afghanistan by the end of 2014. Since that decision was made in 2014, a lot has changed, Campbell told the panel, warning of these new threats. Link to the group took place the following year, when Army Special Forces Staff Sergeant Adam Thomas, 31, was killed by a roadside bomb while on a foot patrol with Afghan commandos in an attempt to track down ISIS-K fighters. It has subsequently grown in size, strength, and influence in Afghanistan, and many of its fighters had previously been imprisoned in detention facilities the U.S. and its Western allies set up across the country. The terrorist network is not to be confused with the Khorasan Group, the research and development branch in Syria of al-Qaeda, the Islamic State's sworn foe during the height of the counter-terror conflicts there. Who are its supporters? The Islamic State group recognized the Afghanistan branch in 2015 as among its affiliates in other parts of the world from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Though the Islamic State group definitively broke with al-Qaeda over its willingness to kill fellow Muslims, the Obama administration used the 2001 congressional authorization to hunt down al-Qaeda and its affiliates as justification to begin a new war in Syria. Instability in Afghanistan caused by the resurgence of the Taliban and the U.S. withdrawal also allowed ISIS-K to gain strength. A string of high-profile and deadly attacks has made it among the most visible brands for would-be terrorist sympathizers, and American intelligence analysts say it has already inspired a wave of foreign fighters to travel to Afghanistan to join its cause. It now operates primarily in southern and eastern Afghanistan. And though it has yet to seize territory from the Taliban, it appears to be positioning itself to overthrow the insurgent network's tentative hold on power in Kabul. ISIS-K is at least a rival of the Taliban and its de facto ally, al-Qaeda, with some assessments indicating the two sides are in fact sworn enemies. What threat does ISIS-K pose? Marine General Frank McKenzie, the chief for all U.S. military operations in the Middle East, told reporters earlier in September in describing the last day of the U.S. war in Afghanistan that likely 2,000 ISIS-K fighters are currently operating in Afghanistan. The U.S. assesses many of them have been recently released from prisons in Afghanistan as a part of the Taliban's efforts to undo any trace of the American presence except, of course, for the billions of dollars worth of weaponry the U.S. left behind. ISIS-K has become infamous for its brutality across territories it controls. It has launched indiscriminate attacks on anyone it considers to be non-believers of its strict and warped interpretation of ancient Islamic norms. And it has already capitalized on the high-profile attack at the Kabul airport that killed 13 Americans. The New York-based counter-extremism project found ISIS-K has effectively employed propaganda sites on the Internet and dark web as a recruiting tool promoting what it considers a victory against the US and the Taliban. The project in an analysis note also suggests that tech companies are not doing enough yet to contain the spread of the group's disinformation. Al-Qaeda has already encouraged its followers to move from places like Syria into Afghanistan, now considered a power vacuum where terrorist groups can thrive. Analysts who spoke to U.S. News say the same threats also apply to ISIS-K and its backers in other affiliates. With ISIS, you also have an untold number of foreign fighters that survived Baghouse, says Colin Clark, senior research fellow at private intelligence firm the Sufyan Center, referring the battle for the Islamic State group's final stronghold in Syria, laying low and potentially waiting for an opportunity like this. It's not yet clear the extent to which ISIS-K poses a threat to targets overseas, either directly or by inspiring lone wolf cells to plan attacks on their own. 2 months before the U.S. completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan, Army General Mark Milley, the military's top officer, told Congress he believed it would take possibly 2 years for terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan, including ISIS-K, to develop the capability to attack the U.S. homeland or an ally country. But that was before the fall of the U.S.-backed government and the rise of the Taliban and its al-Qaeda partners. One lesson from the last 2 decades is that as these networks inspire, compete with, and fuel each other, the Sufyan Center wrote in an analysis note analyzing the effect of the September 11 attacks on security infrastructure elsewhere, including in Europe, so must our societies cooperate more effectively in devising appropriate and properly scaled countermeasures. What can the U.S. do about it? Among the most bitter realities for American war planners is that they now have to consider joining counterterrorism efforts with the Taliban, the group the U.S. initially invaded Afghanistan to overthrow, but which now controls almost all of the country. It's possible, Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters on September 1 with an air of reluctance when asked about this new potential arrangement. It's not known what other opportunities the U.S. would have to stave off the threat. The withdrawal plan Biden announced in April relied upon a well-equipped, well-armed Afghan army that the president claims existed at the time, despite skepticism from most other analysts and officials about its strength. The Pentagon has boasted of its ability to conduct over-the-horizon attacks against terrorist threats in Afghanistan from outside the country, yet how it would be able to pull off such logistically complex missions without nearby bases or intelligence sources on the ground remains unproven. And John Kirby, a spokesman for the Defense Department, has declined to say whether U.S. commanders still had the authority on their own to target ISIS-K following the August 31 deadline Biden set to end the U.S. war presence in Afghanistan. But even if the U.S. decides to enter into some sort of arrangement with the Taliban to defeat their shared foe, it's unclear what positive effect that would have. Militant groups like the Taliban benefit from presenting a moderate face, says Max Abrams, an expert in international security and professor at Northeastern University. It has already instructed its soldiers not to harass civilians and withheld taking credit for terrorist attacks. In its efforts to portray itself as moderate, the Taliban will exaggerate the IS-K threat, Abrams adds, so as to be seen as a counter-terrorism solution against the even worse Afghanistan-based extremists. This is 77 News Stations. J.Emma Clarke. Product by 77 News. Gmail 77newsandworld@gmail.com